Hello and welcome to Verso Live, a new virtual event program to celebrate 50 years of Verso books. All events are streamed live and will be available to watch again after the event has finished via our YouTube channel. Questions and comments can be made via the YouTube chat box. We hope you enjoy the event.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Verso Live. We're going to be here tonight with Maya Goodfellow, author of this great book, Hostile Environment, and myself, Fernando Sdrigotti, author of Jolts, a collection of stories that came out this year. Maya published this book in 2019 with Verso. They invited me to talk about immigration, xenophobia, racism as some of the topics of my book deal with the life of an immigrant. So hi, Maya, thanks for the invitation.
Hi, no, thanks for coming. Yeah, just for those of you who don't know, my name is Maya Goodfellow. So I've written the book Hostile Environment last year, and there's a new edition that is just about to come out, which has a chapter that sort of looks at immigration enforcement during coronavirus and everything that's happened during the general election. So maybe some themes that we'll pick up on later in the discussion. But yeah, we're here to talk about both of our books and I guess more broadly the issues around immigration in Britain and immigration discourse and policy in the UK.
I didn't know you were going to do an updated version. No one told me that. That's great because something I want to talk about immigration and coronavirus when we get to that point. Let me first say, I mean, I really, really enjoy your book in a kind of angry way. I got very angry reading your book. Of course, not with you. I got angry with the things I read. I knew some I've lived through, you know, because I came here as an immigrant of a different kind, perhaps, you know, with more rights at time. I've been here for 20 years, you know, things have changed dramatically in the last 20 years. But also, I've been following some of the debates around immigration, but I didn't know how bad it is, and I think your book captures that very well. Also, I didn't know it goes on. I mean, I thought that the immigration baiting was a relatively new thing, and we can see in your book that this has been going on for quite a long time. So, would you like to tell us how you get to? Why do you decided, to write this book? What was the motivation behind Hostile Environment?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's a number of different reasons I think that I decided to write it. And one is that right after the EU referendum, there was a sort of response to what had happened in terms of the way that the vote had gone, the vote to leave the European Union. And there was a few politicians, in particular those that would sort of consider themselves on the left, I think, that this was going to turn the UK into a country that it had never been before. So really, really inward looking and really hostile, basically turn it into a really nasty country. And I think that we don't want to ignore the really, really specific and dangerous forms of xenophobia and racism that sort of encouraged and cultivated by that referendum and everything that's happened since and the way people have been impacted by policy. But I was sort of puzzled or depressed, or maybe not that surprised, but still frustrated, maybe is the best word, with this sort of reaction, because it means that you really have got to ignore all of the past 60 years or longer of British history to think that it was going to turn, the EU referendum was going to turn Britain into a place it had never been before. It sort of erased this whole long history of anti-immigration discourse and policy. And so one of the reasons I sort of wanted to write it was to, I guess, set that record straight a bit and drawing on a lot of academic literature to try and do that in an accessible way. But I think the other reason I decided to write the book, the thing that sort of encouraged me to do so, was in a way, I guess it's sort of a conversation with the left and more broadly liberals as well. And so I wanted to look at actually how the Labour Party and the Labour movement had reproduced anti-immigration discourses, the way in which they'd implemented anti-immigration policies. So, for instance, the Labour Party throughout its history has implemented a lot of incredibly racist legislation around immigration. And whilst there's been resistance to that, I think that history of Labour's complicity and production of specific forms of anti-immigration sentiment is sort of erased. And then the final thing, I think, is that the arguments against immigration, so like the anti-immigration arguments, are so widespread and I wanted to unpick them. So I wanted to sort of map out how they looked. What are the arguments, the different arguments that are made against immigration? And then I wanted to challenge them and suggest an alternative way of understanding movement, essentially with the understanding that people have always moved, people will always move, and actually we should be creating a world in which people are just able to move regardless of how much money they've got in their bank account, what their passport is, where they're from, what their race is, what their religion is. And I suppose I thought that quite a lot of the anti-immigration arguments are quite widespread, to the degree that they're reproduced at times unwittingly. And so they're really part of the dominant narrative around immigration. And the aim was to sort of trace that history as well as try to challenge it.
So you don't subscribe to this idea of 2012 Olympics UK when everything was okay, we were all friends, we were all getting along very well. That's what you're telling me.
No, yeah. I think we want to, you don't want to erase like the positive things that have happened in the UK. So I don't want to present a picture. One of the big anti-immigration arguments actually is that anti-immigration sentiment is an inevitable or natural reaction to too much immigration. So this idea that the only way to stop people from disliking immigration is to reduce the number of people coming into the country. Like, obviously this is always racialized, it's always specific groups that are seen as a problem. All of those groups change, but I don't buy that thing that it's inevitable. So I don't subscribe to this narrative around the Olympics. I wasn't in London then. I wasn't really, I wasn't into that at all. And I think that the way that's been rewritten, that rewriting of history is dangerous, but that doesn't mean that I think that like these sentiments and these forms of xenophobia and racism are an inevitability. I think they're produced.
Yeah, I was asking ironically, needless to say, but one of the things I feel your book does really, really well in a very convincing way that really sold it to me is how you show how ideas of immigration in the UK have been always linked to racism, and how difficult it is to separate them, and how difficult it will be to have a proper conversation about immigration until the UK really deals with its past. And when I mean by dealing with its past, I don't mean singing or not singing Rule Britannia, and whatever the prompts. I don't even know what that is, but they were talking about that. But how connected the two are, and how much, in a way, one of the trends of the right wing have been in the last years to convert this, to come up with this idea of legitimate concerns. Actually, no, people can have legitimate concerns about how the landscape around the towns is changing in front of their eyes. And actually, when you start to think about that, it's actually they don't like to see more brown people. That's more or less what it boils down to, or Eastern European people. So it's always connected to racism in a way. And I want to be clear about this. I don't think it's an exclusive thing about the UK. I think you could probably, in my country, certainly in Argentina, I'm from Argentina, was born there. You find the same, with different kinds of immigrants maybe, but there is always a xenophobia. And you go to Europe, there are so many people idealized as some kind of great land of opportunity and equality, and you see probably many worse things. I personally lived in France before I came here, and I experienced, not against me, but I could see how racism works very clearly. So that's one thing I think is very interesting. But so how? I mean, it's very tangled now, this debate. Yeah, all these issues are very tangled and confused, and sometimes we're talking about things that we not know we're talking about. So how can we untangle them? I mean, do you think they can be untangled? What is the work we need to do?
I mean, that's a big question.
I know, sorry.
I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve and what you actually want to do. And so this thing that you were saying about, I think it's really important to recognize that it isn't just the UK. I suppose I was focused on the UK because it's where I live. And I think actually we do have to think about the specificity. I think there's things we could probably map, and it's something I'm quite interested in, is like mapping the similarities and differences across different countries about how these things are articulated and how they manifest. But I think that in terms of untangling and what we do, it really does depend on what you are trying to achieve. And one of the things that I suppose was most thinking about the history of this, and thinking about how poorly British history is understood, is I was really struck by when the Windrush scandal, the so-called Windrush scandal happened. There was a sort of lack of understanding, I felt, generally, about why these people had come, quote unquote, legally to the UK in the 60s and 70s. So there was a sort of this erasure of the fact that the UK once had this empire that whereby people who were living in the colonies and former colonies could come to the UK freely because they were citizens of Britain or they were subjects. That has been totally erased, and I think that is one starting point for doing some of that untangling, but I don't think that's the entirety of it. I think we also need to think about, I guess, some of the material forms of discrimination that go on within the immigration system, that racism is embedded in a lot of our bordering processes. But to me, understanding the history and understanding actually that the movement is a fact of life, and what the way that our world works in a lot of ways now, and in particular in countries like the UK, is if you can afford to move, where you're coming from, these things, your race, these things will all shape your ability to move. And I think that that's a major problem. But if we understood that more, I think it would really help with the debate. And the other thing I think is important here is, particularly given everything that's happened around the channel crossings and the way that this has been talked about, is shifting away, I think, from, and I sort of came to this conclusion at the end of writing a book about immigration, is shifting it away from being about immigration and immigrants and actually put more focus on the border and what the border is doing and how the different processes of bordering are actually really violent, are actually producing a lot of insecurity, death. And so when we think about the channel crossings, what's often sort of the subtext is often we need stronger borders, to stop people from making these journeys in the first place, but actually it is the borders and the processes of bordering that force people into these really, really dangerous situations. And so I think thinking about it in that way, and thinking about some of the themes that you've mentioned, in terms of like belonging in Britain and how this debate fits in, I was really struck in your book. One of the things that had really that really came out to me, and there was only a few references, is you talked at times about sort of becoming Argentinian, becoming like what you become when you move. And I was sort of interested by thinking about that more human side of what it means to move, because often the way that we're talking about these things is in the abstract, or we're talking about the discourses, or we're talking about the policy. But what really came out to me in the way that you were writing, and there was a lot of overlap, I think, with the themes, even though they're two very, very different books, was this sort of idea of belonging bubbling under the surface. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that and what that process was or wasn't for you, if I'm reading it right, in terms of this process of like becoming an immigrant, or if this was something that was always the case.
I don't know. The thing is, Argentinianness is a quite complicated identity, in the sense that we are partially European, partially Latin American. Being Latin American is already a contradiction, because you are part of you go mix. My family is a mix of things, so it's very hard. You don't question your identity when you are in Argentina. What is it to be Argentinian? Some people, they like to believe they are the most Europeans of Latin America as some form of pride. Of course, this is very racist in itself. And then suddenly you understand that when you stop being in that place, and suddenly your identity becomes different. Now you are the odd one out, and people ask you where you're from, and you start to ask that question yourself: where I'm actually from. So I think it's quite. For me, at least, it was a very rich experience, because it allowed me to understand actually who I am and that contradictions. And I'm not sure I resolved it in any way. At least I understand it's a contradiction, it's like Latin America is a post-colonial place. It's post-colonial places are complicated in the sense that the nations where we come from have been exploited by Spain, but also they are complicit in the murder of the native population. So it's a very complicated identity. If you add on top of that, Argentina, there was a mass migration from Europe. Italy, Spain. My family is I'm at least 50% Italian, 25% Argentinian, the other 25% Spanish. Sorry, the other 25% You can probably find people who are Creoles. This is a very complicated identity. It only becomes more clear in its complexity once you actually live. In being there, you cannot question this because we're all concerned about other things, you know? You're not the odd one out there, so you don't think about this. So there is a lot of that in the book, yeah, about trying to interpolate what it means to be Argentinian and how I discovered it here, you know?
And
I mean, if I answer.
No, yeah, I mean, like on that, like when you were mentioning sort of like legitimate concerns, and I guess the way the political debate is, something that I'd sort of read, and I don't know if it was me because of what I've like the work that I've done. There's one of the things that I read in your book was this sort of, there was a particular chapter where you go to a barbecue, and yeah, and the thing I had sort of sensed, and maybe I was wrong, that there was maybe some kind of sort of subtle xenophobia going on, this sort of idea of like well-meaning liberals, and the tension between being a liberal and sort of believing that you have these progressive values, and then actually how that actually relates to these ideas around immigration and who belongs and who doesn't. And then like I sort of read like maybe some kind of patronizing tone in it, but I wasn't sure if it was me projecting what I think, like what I write about onto your work or not.
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, I used to work in pubs and restaurants, things like that, where you have always people. The first thing they ask is, "Where are you from?" So, where you from? It's generally a very innocent question, you know, but it becomes annoying over time. You know, this process of, okay, you're not from here, you're not from here, you know. So, where are you from? Which I always found striking because I don't think I will ask that from a person. I probably want to know the name before. I'm not really interested where people are from, you know, and it became really annoying. And then the question started to become charged over time. Let's say that question started to make me feel more uncomfortable, and not necessarily because people meant anything, but because since I'm here, I arrived in 2002, I can see the immigration debate, I always like to do this debate, becoming very, very toxic, you know? And I remember being in a bar a few years ago, just before the referendum, probably a year before, and someone asked me that question, and I felt really uncomfortable, you know, and I realized, oh shit, there's something going on. And he was a very liberal person, like you say. He wasn't, you know, like they weren't wearing a swastika or anything that would freak me out, no. But I realized how that question can have a significant weight behind it, you know. And I wanted to write about that and how we all guilty of doing that in some ways. Probably I would do that in my country if I pick an accent, you know. So I would get curious. But over time, when it repeats and repeats, and you work in, you know, you in the context of other things that happen or immigration, it becomes a charged question, and that's what I wanted to write about. You know, there is a lot of irony in that story. So I think it's a comic story in the sense that one of the characters, I think they say, it doesn't matter where they're from, they're all gonna get deported when we leave the EU. It was something like that, you know, which is I know they're all equal, you know, which is I never heard that myself. But you know, that conversation is out there as well, you know. Yeah. So let me bring it back to this idea of belonging. Do you think and traveling and moving around, you know, I think we agree that we are quite. I mean, I don't believe that people should be told where to live because of the place they're born, or because of the passport or the money they make. But how? I mean, you mentioned an idea. Position of how immigration would be in an ideal world. It's geared toward humanity, yeah. To people have a right to be in a place because they're humans. They don't have to show their usefulness to the place where they move, and I agree with that. But how do we convince other people that the immigration is actually good? How do we sell it to them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the people watching, in terms of like where this is coming from, like where the question I think is sort of coming from, and I think there's a really good example of this in the pandemic, is often the justification or the sort of the defense of immigration comes down to, oh, well, these people who are coming here contribute X amount to the public purse, or they enrich our culture and are good for our society. And I think a very, very clear example of the problems with this have been present during the pandemic and in particular during the lockdown. So there's been this big narrative around key workers and the incredibly important work that key workers are and have been and are doing, you know, to keep society going. The people who were out during the lockdowns, putting themselves, risking their lives, like not only the nurses and the doctors, but NHS porters, delivery drivers, supermarket workers, all kinds of people who were really, really doing the work that is essential. A lot of the same people who are sort of dismissed as low skilled and unimportant are paid very low wages and are treated really badly. And one of the sort of discourses that came out of that was actually a lot of these people are migrants. They have moved to the UK, they weren't born here, and they're doing this work, they're doing this essential work, they are key workers. And that is, in a way, that seems like a really positive thing, and it's true that we should recognise the work that key workers have done. That's really, really important. But I was sort of watching this debate unfold and realising that it was sort of reproducing this good migrant, bad migrant narrative, even if implicitly. And so this idea that only the key worker migrants are the people who contribute in the right way or do the right things. And the way that this sort of came out in terms of policy is the NHS surcharge, which is, for anyone who wasn't following that debate, which is essentially a stipulation on a lot of people's visas. So it's something that a lot of people have to pay, as well as paying into the NHS through national insurance and taxes. People have to pay again through the NHS surcharge just because of their immigration status. And there was a lot of, there was a big pushback against this, saying that people who work in the NHS, doctors and nurses in particular, but more broadly, people who work in the NHS shouldn't have to pay this because it's not right, because they're basically paying twice over for the service that they're keeping going. That's true. But what has then happened is there's been a rollback for those people, for certain groups of those people who work in the NHS, and then for everyone else who is who has to pay this because of their immigration status still has to pay it. Just because of this being sort of this division up of the good and the bad. And as I said, we want to recognise the work that people are doing. This doesn't even include all key workers, though, this exemption. And why should it be that you have to do the right thing for the country, for Britain, contribute in the right way, just to be treated decently? Why should anyone have to pay twice over for the health service? That shouldn't be a rule. That should not be part of the immigration system. And so I think maybe in a way I've sort of answered how I think we persuade people or have this discussion is, I think this does have to come down to humanity, and people will often roll their eyes perhaps when you talk about this and think of you as maybe an idealist or really, really out of touch. But one of the things that came out of the Windrush Lessons Learned review, so this was the Wendy Williams review into the Windrush scandal, one of the recommendations that's made, so there's a number of recommendations and then they come under three different kinds of headings, I think, is best how to see it. And one of them is that humanity must be part of the immigration system. That should be central when you're thinking about policy, people's humanity. And I do think that although often people do believe that a lot of the immigration enforcement should look the way that it does, if you can show the human impact, I think that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is really, really broadly having to change the narrative around immigration. And so it's sort of an insufficient answer that I'm giving to you in that it's really, I think it has to be multi-layered, and I think it has to be, like, I've thought about this a lot and loads of other people have done really great work on this. I think it has to be multifaceted how you approach this. But for me, the real starting point is that everyone, regardless of their status, regardless of what visa they're on, regardless if they're documented or not, really should have the right to a decent life. And that's the starting point for me. And I would ask anyone who doesn't believe that why they think that some people shouldn't be allowed to have a decent life just because of where they were born or what their immigration status is.
I agree, absolutely. And one thing that has really irritated me in the years that I've been engaged in the immigration debates, because I had been more active. Now I've taken a step back. It was a few years ago, there was a campaign trying to show posters of useful immigrants, and that really set me off, because there were people trying to defend immigrants who were falling for this trap of basically showing who is useful. And I have to say, maybe personally, as a writer, I cannot show my use very well, I'm not sure which my use for society is, So I thought, okay, maybe this is not good. And then I started to think, actually, if we play by those rules, we are screwed, because we need to start to show the value of human beings. And I'm not sure as a leftist, I want to be doing that. It's not something I agree with. And coronavirus, you mentioned that. I don't know. I don't want to give lines to Satan here because Satan is always listening, but I'm quite surprised that they have offloaded the guilt of the coronavirus second wave and the pandemic on the youth first, a bit on minorities, but so far, I don't know, has it been a backlash against immigration, or is it different when people move by plane and not by dingy, and they're tourists? What do you feel with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of coronavirus, that it actually hasn't been. So there's been this they've sort of used the channel crossings, or the channel crossings has become an issue, and they've sort of doubled down on the very language that they said they weren't going to use after the Windrush scandal. So we see that there isn't a shift there, but there has actually, there's really been a focus actually on young people. I think you're right. I would suggest that it is plausible that and I can't predict the future, so just in case anyone was wondering, but I think it's plausible, and this is sort of where I got to when I was writing the new chapter for the book, as well as looking at the impact of ongoing immigration enforcement during lockdown, which maybe we can talk about in a second, because it's still impacting people in all kinds of ways. I sort of came to the conclusion that it is definitely conceivable that some of the defences and arguments for borders and the necessity of stronger borders and the need to sort of police those borders and then increase bordering within the UK, because the hostile environment does that. It's one of the things that brings bordering into our everyday life, into our NHS, into our schools, everywhere, all around us, in our public services and elsewhere. It's conceivable that the pandemic will become a justification for exactly this kind of bordering. So you can see that as maybe the pandemic if there is ever a point in which we these things even out or things become safer for a long period of time, you can sort of see that actually there would potentially be this discourse around saying, oh, well, look at what happened during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. This is one of the reasons why we need strong borders. You can see...
the same happened with AIDS, no? With the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s.
Go on.
No, I'm saying that it's not the first time they used an epidemic to tell which people to come, I don't know, there were countries that were talking about doing HIV tests on people who visit, So the mechanisms are there. It wouldn't be so unthinkable, I think. I don't know if you know what I mean. It's already happened. So
yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I was looking at more recently, which sort of is different from but relates to that, is also how the discourses around climate change, of a climate crisis, also play into that. So there's this big idea, and it's often talked about in quite hysterical or scaremongering terms, of the climate refugee or the climate migrant. And there's a lot of liberal politicians who will say, oh, waves of people are going to come from all over the world, and it's a really difficult place for the left, because I think a lot of people on the left and the environmental movement have reproduced that discourse. But actually, what you find is when you look at movement, it tends to be within regions or within countries, and B, climate is just one thing that is sort of in creating this precarity. What we should be striving for is, and this is something that a number of people said to me when I was interviewing people for the book, we should be striving for a world in which people have the right to stay as well as the right to leave. And so it's not only about issuing these hysterical warnings around the climate crisis. The climate crisis is real, but these ideas around movement aren't helpful, and talking about in these terms is not helpful. It also doesn't correspond with how people are moving. And it just basically gifts the far right a narrative. I think it will allow, it already has in some ways, but maybe we'll see the far right taking climate seriously, but only on the basis that it's necessary to strengthen ethno-nationalist borders. So I think you can see a number of ways that these things may potentially go. someone has asked a question that says, can you talk about the UK and the EU? There is an idea in much of Europe that people from other EU countries are not migrants really, but in the UK, the answer is yes. I don't know if you have you were talking about living in France. I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, when I arrived to Europe as an Argentinian. I didn't arrive with a European passport. So my first year here was quite strange. I don't want to go over too many details about how strange it was, but let's say I was waiting for my Italian passport. So when I moved to Ireland first, and then to France, and then to UK, I arrived as an Argentinian. So really, I have no idea. I mean, I'm still, if people ask me where I'm from, I'm not going to say I'm Italian here. So I cannot answer that. I'm also not so sure about if you move inside the EU, being from another European country, I'm not considered an immigrant. I don't know. I don't buy that. I've seen how people live, and I don't think you're still from another country. I think one of the things that this referendum causes this fantasy that there is something as a very strong European identity. I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think people in Europe still have very strong national identities. So this idea of the UK versus Europe is a bit, I'm not sure it's useful. I don't know if I answered the question, but you know what I mean? I don't think there is a European identity there that is so strong.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question, and I wonder, I don't know in terms of like thinking about different EU countries and how the discourses are around different groups of people, because I think one of the telling things is in the UK, it's really messy. So at different times you might be seen as an immigrant depending on where you're from, and at different times you may not be, in particular in relation to Europe. And so there is a particular language around Eastern Europeans that is different in a lot of ways from people who are, say, France or Spain. But that isn't to say those people then can't also at times be cast as the problem immigrant. And so there is a real shifting nature to it. And I think that's best evidenced also by the fact that right after the EU referendum, it was not only people who were like sort of marked out and heard to be maybe from Poland or parts of Eastern Europe, but it was also people of colour in Britain, including people who had been born in Britain, which tells you sort of about this the shifting nature of who's marked out as an immigrant and who isn't, and that is sort of best exemplified, I think, by this expat immigrant sort of.
Oh my God.
Different. Yeah, I know that it's something that you maybe also want to speak to. That is what that's doing, and then obviously it's really, really incredibly racialized. And again, it sort of depends on where you are in the world and who you are and how you're moving and who you're interacting with. But there's certainly like I did my PhD was about international development discourse, and most people who move from places like the UK to other countries to do development work are seen as expats. It's so clearly racialized, and I don't know if you want to speak a bit about that, because I think that I don't think we have an equivalent word in Spanish. You know, you're an immigrant, and I never heard that word before. Expat is a fascinating word because it basically means that when a British person moves for work or whatever, they move wherever, they're not going to be an immigrant, they're going to be an expat. And I always wonder why is there. I think there are issues of race, but I think there's also issues of class. There are issues of colonial history, you know, of people who is allowed to move around the world, you know, and I think it has to do as well with a kind of exceptionalism that you find maybe in some kind of traits of British and American and Australian cultures, you know. I think I tend to link it very much with the English word, Anglophone word. I don't know if this exact word exists in other languages. I don't think we have a word in Spanish for that. We tend to use inmigrante, exiliado, autoexiliado, other words, but expat is weird. That's so interesting. So even if people are moving to, say, do development work, so like work in international development in the countries that they go, so say if someone someone from the UK, and this isn't the case for everyone, but if a white British person moves from the UK to, say, India to work in international development, I mean, I've interviewed people and they have described themselves as expats. there isn't, like, how would those people just not describe themselves at all in that? There's like, do they call themselves immigrants, or is there just not a language for it?
I don't think there's a language for it, because I at least in my country, the biggest kind of migration movement outside of the country have been produced by economic crisis, dictatorships. So that's probably more common to find people who would say, I'm a self-exiled, an auto-exiliado, I'm an economic migrant, I'm living abroad. But this word of the expat, I'd never heard it before. It's fascinating, it's because then you realize maybe we should use that word, incorporate it. We are expat, we're not immigrants, I'm an expat, look, probably that's the key. I don't know. It's fascinating, that word, and how people deploy it, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, and
people
I think one of the it's really true that one of the things that I kept coming back to when I was doing the research for the book was when people talk about illegal immigrants, which is the term, like, I find, it's really damaging and not helpful. But they mean people who, like, are undocumented, I guess. Similarly have problems with it as a term, but I find it slightly less dehumanizing. They usually aren't thinking of white Australians who've overstayed their gap year or whatever, who've overstayed their visa. They're not thinking of, they don't see those people, even if at times they're seen as immigrants, they certainly wouldn't be seen as, like, the problem immigrant. And obviously these things can shift and change, but that's where we are now. And I think that's the way that I often think about how the expat immigrant debate, or like the distinction, manifests not only when it's being articulated explicitly, but when it's also just like how it's underlying the debate, because that distinction tells us something more about the racialized way that the debate is sort of structured.
You mentioned Australian, people who overstay the visa. Is there any kind of research that shows if people who are from United States or Canada, the Commonwealth, former Commonwealth, I don't know, Australia, New Zealand, do they get detained as well, sent to immigration detention centers? So does it happen? I don't know.
There is work. There's actually a book that the name of it escapes me, that I haven't actually read yet, that is about detention. And one of the things from the analysis that I've read of someone else recounting this book is that there are people do get detained. It's not like it doesn't happen at all, and so we don't want to ignore that. But I think it's just I think, and I can't say this. I really have to check my sources and my facts, but I think that it is far less regular. Like it's less of a thing that happens regularly. But even during this sort of the EU debate, there has been instances of people from the US and other countries struggling to come to the UK or being able to stay here, and so it is complicated. That is complicated and knotty. But I think the people who often sort of get ignored are the people who are seen to be the less good migrants or the less deserving migrants, which I think takes us back to that good migrant, bad migrant distinction that we were talking about.
You mentioned Latin American immigrants in your book, and I remember in my first 5 years when I lived here, most of the work I did were in kitchen, and there were many Latin American people like myself working in kitchens, Brazilian, Colombians, Ecuadorian, and it's not rare to have immigration raids where the van comes to the kitchen, people get out and start to ask for documents, which is a legal vacuum there, because you don't even need to carry your ID in this country. So it's a very weird situation. Those things happen, they are intensified. What is the situation now with these immigration rates? How do they target people? What do we know about this?
Well, what we know tends to be the way that the government publicize it, or the way that it sort of gets publicity. And so one of the things that, obviously things have shifted with the pandemic and how these are happening, but these raids do happen, and it's something that actually governments from New Labour right through to now New Labour in particular, they did quite a lot of boasting about these kinds of raids, talking about finding people and deporting them. And so it is a really big issue. And I think one of the issues is exactly what you're talking about, which is not the fact that you don't have to carry a documentation, but also knowing your rights and what your rights are. And this is I think they sort of, it's a really, it's such an awful practice, and it really seems to be part of a attempt to seem tough to the public. And I think that that's one of the ways that it's used, as well as like the impact that it has on people personally who have to go through that, and then what happens to them afterwards. There seems to be like it's used politically to sort of create this sense of toughness and try and instill in people fear that I think they also instilled through the hostile environment. There is also another question, and we should have said at the start, if you have any questions, then just put them in the comments box, and we'll try and answer questions that come through. And so someone has asked, how do you avoid becoming emotionally overwhelmed or burnt out when conducting long-term research on topics like race and colonialism as a person of color? And I guess as well, how like writing about these things yourself when you've experienced them, like the toll that takes. And I mean, I guess it's a really important question and a really difficult one, because I think it is really a lot. It's a lot to sort of process, and when it's so bound up with you and your family and like the things that they've experienced, and it's particularly when you're meeting people who've like lived through this stuff and getting them to then recount that. It's not you I think have to constantly question yourself on that and the ethics of getting people to speak about those experiences, not taking away their agency, if people want to speak about these things. But the best thing I can say is for me, finding a group of friends and creating that sort of network of people who you can discuss these things with and find ways to sort of work through some of these really, really difficult things. And the other side of that is having a way to really try and switch off, which I think is really important if you're doing some of this. So the person who's asked this question said that, you're currently researching British colonialism in Sierra Leone, and I think having people you can talk to about that, but also having ways that you can try to switch off, which can be a really difficult thing to do if it's something that's really personal or that is really like difficult and knotty for you. But finding ways to try and switch your brain off, which for different people is different things. For me, I mean, it sounds a bit ridiculous to say, but I go swimming. It's one place where I think about nothing, and I figured that out whilst I was sort of doing this research. So if you can find a way to also, as well as create that network for yourself, sort of turn your brain off a bit. At times that's something that I do. I don't know about you, like writing some of these things, about you said some of the experiences and stuff.
I think it's very, very different kind of work, I could feel it was harrowing to read this book, so it must have been harrowing to write it. In my case, I mean, it's just, I don't think it's so it doesn't put so much pressure on me, perhaps more on my readers, hopefully. But certainly it's a really good question, because that was something that came to me when I was reading your book about the human cause of this, and not only for you as a writer, but these people. Some people came to this country because they thought they would get a better life, and the life had been turned around. That's it's a terrible thing. So what do you think is the ultimate aim of the hostile environment? You think that they do believe that people will stop coming? If it's so difficult, it's just like electioneering? What do you think this?
I mean, so my short answer is, in a way, I think that it's both. I think that they do want to appear tough, but they also think that this will act as a deterrent, even if the evidence suggests otherwise. And like a good example of that is, again, thinking about the Channel crossing. This has been part of this idea of trying to stop people from making dangerous journeys has been in the political discussion at least since New Labour, if not before, and the response has almost always been the same, which is we need to stop pull factors, which are these sort of often things that are mythical and actually not true. So things like having, if people know that they can come and there's state support for them, and so that's the reason why the state support for people who are waiting on their asylum claim is so pitifully low, just under £40 a week. You have to pay for all your essentials. It's why you can't work if you're waiting on your asylum application. It's partly why the system is so cruel and so unforgiving and so hostile. If you are waiting on an asylum application, you'll arrive, you'll start being processed, and then you'll be dispersed to different parts of the country. Like, you'll have no say over that. And so I've spoken to loads of people who have been sent to somewhere they don't know, where they don't know anyone at all, no networks, and that's a really difficult thing to have to do if you've made these really difficult journeys. And so the narratives have been the same for a really long time, even though the evidence shows that getting rid of so-called pull factors doesn't stop people from trying to make it to the UK, because people are people. They aren't these sort of like unthinking economic units who are out for what they can get. They're human beings who would want to come to a country like the UK for loads of different reasons, like the colonial history, like speaking the language, like having family or friends here. And so I think I do think there's a wanting to seem tough, but I guess my other answer to it is I almost don't care why they're doing it. I just think that it shouldn't be done. And so I did spend, and a lot of people have spent quite a lot of time thinking about, what are the reasons they're doing this? And sometimes those reasons matter because it helps you to sort of argue against them, but sometimes actually it just doesn't matter, and they're just doing it, and the fact that it's being done and the outcomes of it is the most important thing. And someone in the chat has asked a question saying, could you both talk about how often people have to cross a border? So having to cross a border to access healthcare, to get a job or education, and so many British people are now border guards. And I mean, in a way, you've described exactly it already. It's everywhere. The border is everywhere. It means that people are scared to access healthcare. It means people have to show their right to be in the country if they want to have a job, if they want to rent a house. And it has so many people, doctors, nurses, teachers, university lecturers, landlords, so many people have been turned into border guards. And I think that maybe this is a bit of a clumsy comparison to make, but the sort of outrage or uproar around people, this discussion in the past few days around whether people should call the police on their neighbours if they have more than 6 people in their garden, and a lot of Conservatives have pushed back against that and said that this is like unconservative, it's not right. Well, actually, why don't we apply some of these things to the immigration system? Why should it be that people are checking up on people just so they can't access basic services? And the government does there want to send a message to people that they shouldn't come to this country, they shouldn't access those services. And I would just quickly say before I hand over, is that what I found speaking to people during the height of the lockdown is that by refusing to suspend the hostile environment, which is what the government did, they refused to suspend it. They made some changes, but they didn't suspend it in its entirety. They didn't put out any major public announcements. You know, the government of the go home bans didn't even properly publicise the small changes they had made to the immigration system. It meant that people were still terrified to access healthcare. Some people terrified to go to their GP or the local hospital, didn't have any kind of financial support if they lost their jobs or if they needed any kind of support from the state and had no recourse to public funds. They could apply to change that. But actually, for a lot of people, it was really confusing, and a lot of people just felt, and particularly if you're undocumented and you can't do that, you can't do these things most likely anyway. Essentially, we are living in a country where we were being told that we were all in it together. We were being told when Boris Johnson was in intensive care that his humanity was the most important thing, and that same government were basically keeping in place rules that meant people couldn't access healthcare or were scared to access healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. And so for me, that was the most obvious sign that of how damaging the hostile environment is. People have been told about this, right? And that's the outcome.
It has a terrible cause. I do remember the first time I was asked, I broke a toe. I can't remember, playing football probably, and I went to UCH, a hospital, and the person who received me said, you have a right to use NHS. I can't remember the words, but I was like, what? I have been living here for 12 years, and it was probably around 2011 when that happened. That's when it really accelerated, the hostile environment. Of course, we got the racist bans that you have in the cover of your book, which was a fantastic coup. Horrible, of course, but very effective political, I think, by Theresa May. And from then it's all been downhill. Let's see what happens. Do you got any comments there? Any questions?
Yeah, someone else has asked, should the long-term goal be abolition of borders then, or is that naive? And I guess it's sort of broadly asking us as well, maybe something to think about is like what kind of abolitionist reforms would be necessary in the short term if we think that abolition of borders is the way to go. What do you? What I'm going to ask you what you think about.
Well, I do believe that borders shouldn't exist, but I don't know how to implement it, how to make it, how to move it from this naive point. I know for sure that if capital can move freely, so could people, but I don't know how they would implement it. I'm not sure capital should move freely either, but I think there is a humanitarian call to at least push for that and try to move the discussion towards that, however utopian is or not. I think we need to insist on that. That's my point. I don't know how I would implement it. I'm washing my hands here, but
it's really. I do think. Again, there is some work on this, but I do think, I guess, more work needs to be done on fleshing out the steps, or at least, or if anyone wants to say in the chat of any good works that they've read on this, is something that I think a lot about. I think, particularly given everything that's happened around the calls for, like the work that's done on prison abolition, and also the necessary calls for things like defunding the police and what that will look like and what that means. I think that we should be having some kind of conversation around what the border does in order to get us to this place of thinking about what the border should or shouldn't be and whether there should be the border. And one of the things is, I guess, around this discussion around abolishing the border is that doesn't solve all the problems that we've just talked about. And I mean, a lot of people who are abolitionists wouldn't say that it would, so I'm sort of stating the obvious, but in the things like global inequality, things like some of the reasons why people have to move in the first place, so going back to the thing about people being able to stay if they want, that has to be bound up in any kind of discussion around what it would mean to dismantle the border. But in terms of abolitionist reforms, I mean, I guess there's more, these aren't necessarily abolitionists as such, or I mean, maybe they could be tweaked and made more radical, but there are some things that can be done in terms of our current immigration system around things like detention centres, closing down detention centres, around things like ending the hostile environment is the most obvious one that could just be done away with, and I think should be done away with. But also making the immigration system something that is possible to navigate without having to have huge amounts of money, bringing back legal aid. So I think these aren't as radical as we should and need to be, but there's some things like, I guess, in the shorter term that could be done or could be advocated for, or there could be sort of some kind of political agreement around, maybe some kind of coalition between some of the people you might need in order to produce that change. But I do think we should think about how the border, all the problems and damage and violence that is created by bordering and what the border does, and it's for so long in our political discourse being spoken about is something that produces safety and is necessary, but I would just ask safety for who and necessary for who. And
yeah, I'm sure the hostile environment also creates problems of security for people who are born in this country, because you're creating marginal, sending people through the cracks all the time. That cannot be good for society, in a practical way. I'm saying it's even backfiring for the people it's supposed to protect. It's ridiculous. It's and I think without going to, like I say in one of the pieces I wrote for Open Democracy, when there was this racist van stand, which really pissed me off. I was so angry. I had to write a piece about it. And you don't need to be an open borders activist. We could be, but you don't need to be to realize there is something wrong in this hostile environment that is going to create problems, going to divide people even more, fracture communities, destroy people's opportunities. One of the things that I think I try to show in my book is in a kind of fictional memoir, there is a game going on there about how not everyone who moves away from the country is, people are different. Not everyone is the same. But when you leave your country, there is like an erasure of your identity, but also of your cultural capital. And in many ways, if you move to a place where you don't know people, where you have no networks, you're going to have to start from zero. So if they are putting barriers to that process, even, it's going to be harder, and you're probably going to fall through the cracks, So it's like, why would you lie to have people who are falling through the cracks? It's going to wait on the medical system, on the services. It's insane, even from a practical point of view, beyond the humanity side. It's ridiculous. It makes me angry. Sorry. But another thing I want to talk about before because I see we're running out of time there. It's so. Sorry, I got some notes here. So how do you think someone who works in this hostile environment feels? Do you talk to anyone who is implementing this hostile environment? Because it feels like you must weigh on them too in some way.
Yeah, there's a number of groups that sort of resist this, and one of them is Docs Not Cops, who they essentially do trainings with healthcare professionals around actually what the hostile environment means and what it means, like what they're expected to do and the problems with that. At least that's how I would characterize it. Maybe they would describe it slightly differently. And they groups like that are really great and really necessary to sort of campaign against this. And one of the things when I interviewed one of the people from Docs Not Cops, one of the things that they said was that one of the sort of things that needs to be done is that even explaining to people how this is what they're expected to do and why and the problems with that. And so for a lot of people, right, they are doing their job, they have very little time, a lot of people are overworked, underpaid, and so it's not always something that everyone knows about or even understand, and has the time to understand about the ins and outs of it. And so I think one of the things is having those kinds of interactions and those kinds of trainings that people even know that this is the case. And I do think a lot about in the university, it's so normalized. At least
with the cards.
Maybe you have a different, but in my understanding, and I thought, and how we're all complicit and the ways that actually we've been pushing back. And there's groups that do this. There's a group that works on the on campaigning against the hostile environment in the universities, which are really important. But I think it could be more widespread in terms of resistance to it.
Yeah, at least in my place, they automatize this with the student cards, but they always reminded us to keep an eye on, I think it's tier 4 students or whatever. I don't know how they call them. It's horrible. It's ridiculous. I mean, but I think, there you got more space to negotiate this, at least in some workplaces. Not sure if you are a doctor, how much space you got, what can happen, So, yeah.
Yeah, it's true. There is, and I think there have been pushbacks, but it's sort of damning. It's a damning indictment of where we are, that the Windrush scandal happened and the hostile environment is still in place. And I think, I guess, since we have such little time left, one of the things that I think is sort of what I said before, but is really important to think about is the fact that when the Windrush scandal happened, the sort of justification for needing to keep the hostile environment in place from the government was that it was necessary to deal with illegal immigrants. And that is, for me, that is one of the key points that you have to go at and challenge, because they will keep regressive policy or implement more regressive policy on the basis of how needing to stop illegal immigrants from being in the country. And then that itself should matter, that alone should matter. So what I'm about to say next isn't the thing that makes all of this matter, but then what they do is they use these techniques on everyone else. They will roll out or they'll try to roll out some of this stuff, some of the monitoring. This is something that Gracie May Bradley at Liberty talks about quite a lot, or I've heard her talk about. They will try to roll out a lot of these sort of techniques of control and monitoring to everyone else, and that shouldn't be the thing that makes us care. The thing that should make us care is that this happens at all. But I think that tells us who you should be centering and how. It should always be the people who are seen as least important, most marginalized, most demonized, and in this instance, it is the people who are dismissed as illegal immigrants, and that is, that hasn't shifted. Alan Kurdi died. That picture of him washed up on the beach was all over the front pages. That didn't change it. The Windrush scandal happened. That didn't change it. People are crossing the channel now, and someone has died crossing the channel. That didn't change it. And so I think actually going right for that, right for the center of the argument, is one of the most important things that has to be done, as well as looking at the borders.
Absolutely, and I think your book does a really good job arguing that. Okay, this is an amazing book. Congratulations, I really enjoyed it. Like I say, it made me angry, but I think it's a good thing. And thank you for inviting me to do this.
No, thanks. And I'll say your book as well. I read it in a day. I couldn't put it down. So yeah, I really enjoyed reading it. So many of the themes that we've talked about this evening, are woven into how you've written all of these stories, and I think that it's I'd encourage people to read it.
Thank you for having me once again.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye. Bye.